Welcome to A New Capitalism, the podcast that will show you how you can invest your money to help create a more just and prosperous economy for all. Here's Frank Altman.
I'm back with Tim Smith, the co-founder of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. We've been talking about how he got involved in responsible investing and corporate responsibility 50 years ago, and how he's led hundreds of corporate engagements and negotiated shareholder resolutions, driving positive change at ICCR. So, Tim, let's get into regulatory frameworks. In part one, you mentioned proposed changes at the SEC. But if you could wave a magic wand, what would you like to see done at the federal level around these regulatory frameworks?
Well, of course, the SEC is setting rules for companies to live by in the marketplace. So if they require that companies disclose certain information about their greenhouse gas emissions and impact on climate, that will be a norm that all companies would follow. And the importance of that, as you well know, Frank, is that many companies will say, well, you're asking us to do this, but we have to compete with other companies in the marketplace. We don't want to take steps that single us out or put a target on our back or cost us money if others don't have to do it. Well, so having a set of common rules for the road means that companies are all going to be required to disclose information on climate change or on diversity and human capital. It'll become commonplace. One of the second things that I think is important that the regulatory framework's not doing right now is looking at ways in which the impact of some companies, I'm thinking of the negative impact, if you are in a diversified portfolio, you can't just divest yourself out of a set of problems. If a whole industry or set of companies is causing problems for the marketplace, that's going to affect your portfolio. So it's doing a systemic analysis of how our investments are going to be affected by various companies' actions is also important. Let me also say, Frank, I know we might want to talk about this separately, but there is an attempt right now, a vigorous one, to push all this genie back in the bottle. And conservative voices in the Congress have had a whole month of hearings they called ESG month, where they held hearings criticizing ESG. Well, I think there were 8 hearings, and a number of bills were marked up in July and might make their way to the floor. Already 4 came out of an education committee meeting yesterday. And so these are attempts to try to put limits on, say, ERISA impacted pension funds so that they would not be able to take any environmental, social governance factors into account in making investment decisions. And the requirement would be you only focus on economic factors to make investment decisions. Well, the irony is that many of these ESG factors are economic factors as well. But the proponents of this legislation are really trying to block any pension funds that are under ERISA from addressing ESG. Right now, the Department of Labor has rules in place that came out in the Biden administration, which do allow ERISA funds to take into account ESG matters as long as they have a positive impact on the bottom line. But again, in our nation of culture wars, we're having attempts to change the regulations to make it more difficult. A second attempt by the same players in Congress to limit the right of shareholders to file resolutions to make it much more difficult and disempower the SEC from some of the roles it plays in the shareholder resolution process. So these systemic factors that you and I have been talking about, there's critics who want to change the game and make sure that the ability of investors to use ESG in investing are limited or obliterate it.
So you're hitting on a couple of things I want to make sure we get to in this conversation. And the first one is the conflict between these factors, ESG factors or others that people say are diverting the investor from the one and only measure that they should be looking at, which is economic return, and the role of fiduciaries in this whole process, who are governed obviously to have the best interests of the participants in these plans in mind. At the same time, and this has always puzzled me a little bit, you have participants in plans who are, in many cases, contributing money for their retirement, because most plans now, or many plans, have gone into the 401k world and the defined contributions rather than defined benefit plans. I don't want to get too wonky on this, but there also are many participants in these plans who are retired and are taking their money out. And so it's always puzzled me when people talk about fiduciary responsibilities without looking at the life cycle of the plan participant, the long term as well as the immediate term. It seems like the immediate term is always the one that's important, and the long term gets lost, except for the long term being making sure that there's money there for retirement at the end of it.
That's right.
So when you think about the negative impacts that are occurring in many communities where plan participants, they might be unable to move and their communities are falling apart around them for one reason or another, disinvestment, racial discrimination, et cetera, it's those investments in those communities that are oftentimes viewed as not part of the responsibility of investment managers or others to weigh in on.
Well, terribly important points, Frank. And of course, you're absolutely right. If you're investing in a pension fund, you are a long-term investor. So, for example, I work closely with Tom DiNapoli, who is the comptroller of the state of New York, and they have, I think it's over $275 billion that they invest on behalf of their members. And they are very clear that they are long-term investors and that they have to be prudent, taking care of other people's money. It's not their money to play with. They are stewards of that capital. I'm also on the board of the United Methodist Church's pension fund. It's called WestPath. And likewise, they have about $28 billion, and they are investing that money for their ministers and workers within the church. And they have a responsibility to make sure they're caring for the long-term care of those investors, their members. So you're absolutely right. And that is in creative tension with the marketplace, which keeps on turning our attention to the next quarter's returns, aren't they? Well, if you're a long-term investor, it's not like you don't pay attention, but it doesn't matter that the market has gone through this cycle and gone down and then it's coming up nicely. You want to see what's happening long-term, not just what's happening in the last quarter. Your second point is an important one too, Frank, because one of the cutting-edge parts of being a conscientious investor, it's the arena you help champion and build and strengthen, is try to find opportunities for individuals or institutions to put money to work with a double bottom line, not just looking at returns for themselves, but looking at the opportunity to have an impact, positive social impact. So, for example, WestPath, the United Methodist Pension Board, has, I think it's $700 billion in investments in things like low-income housing or certain kinds of community development, credit unions and financial institutions. And these are done in a prudent manner so they do not jeopardize long-term results, but they are seen as part of the fixed income portfolio, and they both provide reasonable returns and that kind of social impact.
I'd like to sort of pat you and WestPath on the back, as when I was at CRF Westpath we were one of the early organizations that they invested in through various bonds and structures that we set up to fund affordable housing around the country. So there are examples, even in the pension fund world, where these kinds of things can happen. They're not mainstream yet, but I applaud the groups that have pioneered investment strategies around this. And by the way, they were getting great returns.
Oh, that's important to say. So you reasonable returns, strong returns, at the same time as you can really track how a social impact. And you could speak to, Frank, the administration's work in the last 2 years in providing new capital to community development financial institutions. So, understanding that this is a generator of jobs, but also preservation of community.
I would like to turn a little bit to your own personal journey in this field, and what, in terms of the work that you've done across a number of these platforms over the years, what are you most proud of?
I'm proud of the fact that investors, at least working through and with the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, were long-distance runners, sticking with an issue like apartheid in South Africa, and working on it for over 20 years to address the role of companies and banks, and to try to be a force to change that system of apartheid. So that's something I'm proud of. I'm also looking back in older days, Frank, to the campaign that was launched to challenge baby formula companies, from Nestle to Bristol Myers Squibb, who were marketing baby formula in developing countries in ways that were very destructive and caused many kids to get ill and die. Not that the formula was a problem, but it was expensive. Families couldn't afford it. They mixed it with contaminated water, and kids got sick because of that. And considerable pressure from investors and community groups, health professionals, and others led to an international code of conduct on baby formula. And that also led to major changes by companies in their marketing and promotion of that. So I think those are early things we can point to. But going forward, I'm proud to watch my colleagues in As You Sow, a foundation based in California, who are championing a number of issues. But one of them would be plastic waste and plastic production by companies. And they were early pioneers here in raising the issue. They always got respect from companies, but companies didn't feel that the market was quite ready for them to have to make drastic changes. Well, now you've got investors like As You Sow filing with companies on plastic and reducing plastic waste, getting the votes getting over 50%, or the companies being willing to negotiate agreements that 5 years ago they wouldn't have been comfortable with. So the ability to be prophetic about an issue and raise it vigorously over time, and then watch the results is encouraging. So I'd point to issues like that. I'd point to work that's been done on empowerment of women and diversity in the workforce that I think investors have played an important role, not a singularly important role, but an important supportive role in that movement too. There's lots of things that we point to, Frank, at ICCR, where I work, Boston Trust Walden, where we really felt the voice of investors that had a demonstrable and significant impact. And this 50 plus years of work in this space, it's amazing to see some of the changes we've helped bring. I'm going to be honest, though, too. It's also amazing to see the challenges we face right now, right? So the hard work being done on climate change is bringing about real changes by many, many companies. But the question is whether we're moving far enough, fast enough, and without clear federal regulation or prices in the marketplace, we're falling behind in the race to try to protect the planet from climate change. So that's a depressing reality, but you put that on the table beside the significant positive work and you keep on chugging away.
you're singing to the choir here on these long-term issues. We know how the capitalist system can respond when there's an opportunity. And so we'll just take plastics as an example. I have a fair amount of discussion of the issues of what are called negative externalities that oftentimes are not priced into a product.
Right.
So the profit is generated by the positive externalities, and the negative get left for the rest of us to deal with. And plastic is an example of that. People are making money off of plastic. It's everywhere. You just can't get away from it. But yet, if the market starts to say we really don't want this, and maybe regulations, and they're starting to show up in certain industries, you got to pay for a plastic bag at Target now in many communities, et cetera, et cetera. They have an impact, but they also stimulate innovation. When there is a constraint, a tremendous amount of innovation occurs, and we're seeing that with people trying to come up with plastic substitutes that
sustainable.
Yeah. So there's always that opportunity side when you have these issues. It's not just the negative side.
We were both reading a lot of articles, I'm sure, about the fact that there's tremendous challenges in this turn in the road toward net zero of carbon emissions, but there's tremendous market opportunities too.
Right.
So there's money to be made. There's new products to be brought to the market. And so one thing capitalism can do is they can be very creative and move fairly quickly on some of these changes.
Right. I think in the book, I spend a fair amount of time trying to acquaint readers with the concept of social entrepreneurship and the rise of social ventures as part of the capitalist system. And so some of these topics we're talking about are being approached by companies that are literally setting themselves up as public benefit companies. So they're not solely beholden to maximizing shareholder value. They have a profit motivation, but not a profit maximizing motivation. And as they become identified in the marketplace, investors are looking to put their money into those companies or contribute to nonprofits who are also in that social entrepreneurship, social venture world. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that concept as you're thinking about what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, let me sort of use that as a launching pad, because it is fascinating to watch companies redefine who they are and confirm what their mission is as a company that is working to have a positive social impact and not just maximize profit. I know it's commonly thought that boards of companies understand their purpose to maximize return for investors. I think that's not quite right. I think, in fact, many boards understand their role to protect long-term returns for investors. In other words, back to your point of not just what's going to happen the next quarter, but what's going to happen long-term. And to do it without putting the company in significant reputational risk or facing lawsuits or, all the negative things that can happen to a company that's acting irresponsibly. So I think there's many companies, boards who say, I'm not going to simply try to say I'm going to milk every dollar I can and build wealth. We need to do this in a way that serves us long-term and serves society. So you hear Unilever use different language. I forget if they're a public benefit corporation, but I think not. But you even might hear Walmart talking about that too. So ICCR is actually working on a little fact sheet with about, I think we might be up to about quotes from 35 company CEOs and sustainability officers talking about why sustainability is important for long-term value for the company, but also for their society and as part of their responsibility. There's always this creative tension, Frank, and you might disagree with me here, but there's always this creative tension between making money for shareholders and being seen to be a good stock buy, and then acting responsibly and having a long-term vision. But I do know there's lots of boards who don't start off every meeting by saying, well, how are we going to maximize profit this quarter?
Right. I agree with you on that, believe it or not. However, there has been a change at among the largest companies in the United States to move away from this concept of maximizing shareholder value to maximizing stakeholder value.
Yes.
And so how does this stakeholder capitalism play in the world that you're working in or have worked in? And I know that's also controversial, and just as ESG is, there are forces saying, well, you can't do that. It's got to be maximized shareholder.
That's right. The anti-ESG criticism, Frank, is not just about investment firms or leaders like you and me. It's against companies that dare to say that sustainability is an important priority for them and work on climate change or diversity, for example. So the attacks that, if we watch carefully, there are attacks on everybody from Target to Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase. And the attackers blindly say, well, these people have taken their eye off the ball, and they're working on these other issues that are peripheral. Well, if you're Jamie Dimon or many, many other, as the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase or many other companies, you're going to patiently explain that you believe these issues do create long-term shareholder value. These issues meaning the work they're doing on sustainability. So I thought it was important a couple of years ago when the Business Roundtable, which is about 180 major company CEOs, changed their position to talk about their responsibility to serve stakeholders, not just stockholders. And what they were saying is that you have a responsibility to your employees, to your consumers, to your communities, not just to those who invest in the company. Well, for some, that was seen as heresy, right? Gee, shareholders should come first. I don't care what happens to communities. Make me money. Well, I think that BRT wisely said that's very short-sighted. It's not what the public expects, and move toward this endorsing this stakeholder concept. Now, just to be clear, there's a lot of criticism of that from skeptics too, who say, well, you say that, but how are you acting? And I think that's fair commentary. If a company has said, no, we're in favor of the BRT standards, and we're in favor of a stakeholder concept, tell us how you put that into play. And that's why when we ask for companies to do sustainability reporting, it's so important, because it's a company saying, okay, here are my goals and objectives, and here's how I'm trying to implement them to make a difference.
Well, I could go on and on. I have one more question for you, Tim, and that is, what would you tell young people who are coming into managing their own assets, managing assets on behalf of others, coming into the investment industry? What advice would you have for them around all these issues?
I'd start with saying that ESG is the wave of the future. It's investing in a way whose time has come. It does take into account what you've been saying, the externalities that companies face. ESG investors understand that and demand that the companies not just shed those external costs to taxpayers and consumers, but actually take them seriously as part of the cycle of business they do. So I would say that it's a form of investing that its time has come. As you said earlier, I think it's very credible to say it's a form of investing who's providing reasonable market returns. So you do not pay a conscience penalty for investing with your conscience. I think that's an important kind of point to make as well. For a younger person who's investing their own capital, obviously you want to encourage them to look at, as you did, opportunities to invest for impact, not just for feeling good and feeling I'm less compromised, but to say, is my money actually having a positive impact on society? And in that case, there's many more opportunities to invest with an impact lens. I guess we could use that kind of term. If you're a young person getting into the investment industry, hopefully the company you're working with understands the signs of the times and understands they need to provide product to a growing investor community. out there that's concerned about ESG. So we've all read the studies, Frank, of the transfer of capital. More and more women will be in charge of investing in the future, and younger people who are getting into setting aside money for their 401k care about these issues too. So I can remember the vice chair of Morgan Stanley explaining at a conference one time that he'd be shooting himself in the foot if he didn't recognize these trends meant they need to provide opportunities for conscientious investors to invest according to their values and concerns.
Well, Tim, I just can't thank you enough for spending time with me and talking about these issues. It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, nice to see you again, Frank, and thanks for all you've done and the tremendous impact you've had. And I've really appreciated the opportunity to look back over decades, because you and I were both there wearing various hats. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Tim, and thank you for listening to this episode of The New Capitalism. I hope you found value in our conversation and are excited to join us on this journey toward a more just economy. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Thanks again for being part of this community focused on positive change. And thank you for all you do.
This has been A New Capitalism with Frank Altman. If you'd like to connect with Frank and join the movement to create a new capitalism that works for all, go to frankaltman.com. Frank's book is available on print, audio, and ebook formats on all major book-selling sites. A New Capitalism is a production of Forbes Books.